plague doctors did during the Black Death. Flagellation wasn't the only exotic means of trying to prevent the plague. Attempts to prevent the disease resulted in other solutions, particularly from doctors, who not only used all available tools they had at their disposal, based on the medical knowledge they had, which wasn't great, they also dressed themselves up with full medieval pageantry and splendor. This is where we get the plague doctors, and they have the beak costume. They look like weird birds. If you Google images of plague doctor, you'll see this. You can buy plague doctor costumes if you care to dress like this for Halloween. So what they did is try to inoculate themselves by dressing themselves up in a costume, which made themselves look like a huge bird. The costume had a leather hat and a mask that covered their head completely for eye protection and facial protection. It had a primitive type of eye protection in the form of glass eyes, and attached to their mask was a beak, but it wasn't just for pageantry. It was stuffed with herbs and perfumes and spices because they believed that disease was caused by foul air. So if they purified the air in front of them, then that would heal them. I guess it's sort of like a mister with essential oils. Other of their accoutrements included a gown made of thick material, which was covered with wax. And under the gown, the doctor would wear leather breeches and leather gloves to protect his hands from any form of contact with the diseased, and also a wooden stick to beat away people who came too close to him. And these doctors did their best to help people. They'd offer hot drinks to those who were afflicted, believing that the victim would sweat out the disease and rebalance their four humors. They also carried leeches with them, using the age-old technique of bloodletting to reduce their blood so it's in equilibrium with the phlegm and the black bile and the yellow bile. A well-equipped doctor might give strong doses of laxatives to empty their patient's bowels and remove the disease, but unfortunately this more often than not could cause injury or death from dehydration. A more extreme therapy involved coating patients with mercury and heating them in a bath to kill the infection. But again, this probably caused more harm than good because mercury is poisonous, and the heat from the oven could cause serious burns. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. All right, so that's number 2 of what to do during a quarantine. Number 3 is one of my favorites, and I think this is the most actionable for people today because most of us are just simply hunkered down in our houses. And that is to be in the company of your family, maybe a couple of close friends if it's possible, and eat food and tell stories. This idea comes from a classic work of literature from Boccaccio, and it's called the Decameron. The setting for this, just to give a little bit of context, because I think it's useful to understand the Decameron, is in 1348, when the Black Plague is sweeping across Europe. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived from 1313 to 1375, described the plague's effects on his city, Florence. He said, "As plague doctors roamed the cities, society crumbled around them." Or, this isn't him quoting, this is more of a paraphrase. "Locals grew accustomed to frequent robbery, murder, and rape. Relatives and lovers parted ways to blunt the pain of their painful demise. A multitude of sick men and women were left without any care except for the charity of friends, if it could be found at all." Boccaccio describes this scene in apocalyptic terms, basically. "One citizen avoided another, hardly any neighbor troubled about others, relatives never or hardly ever visited each other. Moreover, such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity, that brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs." Okay, so this is him describing what was going on in 1348, and he wrote the Decameron in 1353 as an eyewitness, so good reason to believe what he was saying was fairly accurate. So he published the Decameron in 1353, 5 years later. Decameron is Greek, which I think means 100 days. And the book is structured as a frame story, where there's a framing device used in order to tell 100 stories by a group of 7 young women and 3 men who are sheltered in a villa outside Florence. So the framing device is that these men and women go to their villa, they're under quarantine, they're waiting out the plague, and they tell stories to each other. There's all sorts of different types of stories that are told in the Decameron. They range from erotic stories to tragic stories, practical jokes, and life lessons. It's sort of like the Arabian Nights, where there's a general overall story, but then there's specific tales told within. It's an anthology, or you could consider it like Simpson's Treehouse of Horror or Tales from the Crypt. A little bit more about this story. It begins with 7 young ladies. Their friends, their named are Pomponea, I'll probably mispronounce this, but bear with me, Filomena, Nephili, Fiametta, Alyssa, Loretta, and Amelia. They meet together after Mass, and they're between the ages of 18 and 25, or 18 and 28, and they're all of noble birth. The oldest, Pomponea, says that we should go to our country estates to wait this out. The other women think we should, but they should also bring along some men, perhaps for protection. So they assemble 3 gentlemen that are linked by friendship, or maybe they're related to one of them, Filostrato, Dioneo, and Panfilo, and so the 10 people go to the countryside. And here's a routine they set up during this time. In the morning and evening, they take walks, they sing songs, and they eat exquisite meals and have feasts. They have wine, they have white wine, red wine. In between, they sit together and each tell a story based on a common theme for the day. So on each day, one person tells a story based on a theme, so that's why the Decameron has 100 stories. And the themes could be generosity, magnanimity, or cleverness. The agreement is that they stay for 2 weeks, which is how long a lot of our quarantines are. So there's 2 days that are given for personal obligations. There are 2 days given to religious duties, and that leaves 10 days left over for the storytelling. 10 times 10 days at the end, they have 100 stories, and so this collection of stories and then commentaries by Boccaccio is the Decameron. And some of these stories are original by Boccaccio. Others are retellings or copies of works by other poets or storytellers. And this was common in the Middle Ages, before the ages of copyright law, where people would take stories and appropriate them or retell them or whatever. Let me just give a very brief rundown of the theme of each day, because if you want to do your own Decameron event, here are some ideas. The first day of storytelling was an open topic. There was no assigned theme, but 6 of the themes deal with censoring another person, calling out their wrong, and 4 satires of the Catholic Church. Filomena leads the second day, and she assigns the topic of misadventures that end happily. Nephili is the leader of the third day, and in these stories, a person either has acquired knowledge painfully or they've lost something and then regained it. Filostrato leads during the 4th day, and the storytellers talk about lovers whose relationships end in disaster. Then during the 6th day, looks like I don't have the 5th day in my notes, so bear with me, listeners. Alyssa leads it, and the theme is characters who avoid attack or embarrassment through a clever remark. Dionero leads the 7th day, and these are stories in which wives play tricks on their husbands. Loretta leads the 8th day, and during this, the group tells stories of tricks women play on men, or that men play on women. Amelia leads the 9th day. For the second time, there's no specific theme. And then Panfilo leads the 10th day, and they talk about generosity. The final story of the 10th day is the most famous story of the Decameron, and I'll just give you an idea of what it is. Here's a brief summary. This is the story of patient Griselda. Gualtieri, who's the Marquis of Saluzzo, he's a nobleman, but he doesn't want to marry, but his subjects pressure him to. So he takes a wife, a peasant girl named Griselda. Griselda gives birth to a daughter and a son. Both babies are taken away from her with the suggestion they'll be put to death, but Griselda doesn't protest. Gualtieri then gets more severe, and he declares he needs a noble wife, not a peasant. So Griselda returns to her father's house and leaves her dresses behind, and she feels that they belong to her husband. So Gualtieri calls her back and says that he needs her to oversee the preparations of his new wedding. So Griselda is destroyed personally by this, but she agrees. On the wedding day, a boy and a girl appear whom Griselda don't know. Gualtieri introduces the girl as his bride-to-be. Griselda praises her. Finally, Gualtieri gives up the secret. He tells Griselda that the boy and the girl are her children. He had them brought up by family in Bologna, and that he is taking Griselda back, more beloved now. He says, I want you to teach you to be a wife, or to be submissive. It seems kind of like a strange story, but the reaction of Gualtieri's courtiers is that this is very wise but harsh. Now, the funny thing is, this story sounds strange, and I can see a lot of master's degree students in English writing about the patriarchy here, but this is where the Decameron gets meta because the story itself calls this sub-story ridiculous. The person who's telling the story, Dioneo, finishes by saying that perhaps it would have served Gualtieri right if instead he had run into the kind of woman who, upon being thrown out of the house, would have found someone else to give her better treatment. And I think readers would agree with that. And literary scholars have tried to say, what does this all mean? Some think the Decameron is maybe trying to poke fun at medieval conventions and showing how ridiculous stories like these could be. Maybe it's just trying to have a sense of humor during the plague when everybody is miserable. We don't know exactly. But the point being there, listener, that with what the cast members of the Decameron did of hunker down, tell stories, have good meals, have a good time, not such a bad idea. Okay, let's go to our fourth thing to do during a quarantine or a plague, and that is go hunting or go fishing or do an outdoors activity, cycling. In the Middle Ages, if there were a plague or quarantine, kings loved to go hunting. If they had a country estate that wasn't around too many people and you knew that you needed to get away from the city and the infected, you would go into the outdoors. Oftentimes, when a king was setting up his day's business and he was hearing people come to his court to petition or he's speaking with his advisors, if he had no pressing business in the afternoon, he would typically go hunting. Hunting is great if you're a king or a knight. You get to practice your horsemanship, you get to practice using some weapons and keep up your martial abilities. Get out in the open. It's a lot of fun. Now, as you know, listeners, I always love to bring in examples from the Ottoman Empire, so I'm going to do that. Sultans also loved hunting too. And they had a habit of leaving Istanbul whenever the plague got bad. The earliest sultans didn't even live in a palace. They lived in a semi-nomadic way where they would travel around their domains with their tents and they would set up shop there. And for the first several sultans, they would travel around their domains in this way. But as the Ottoman Empire grows in power, they conquer cities, they build palaces. Then the sultans are mostly hunkered down in their palace and they can't travel around freely. Maybe they would be assassinated. But still, up into the 1450s, with Mehmed the Conqueror, who conquered Constantinople, there was a practice of going to upland pastures in the summer. Malaria would break out in the summer, so it's smart to go to places in higher elevation so there wouldn't be as many mosquitoes. But they would also leave in order to escape the epidemics. And if you're going to leave, you would typically go to a rural estate where you could go hunt. The favorite place for sultans to go to was the city of Edirne. Modern-day Edirne is right on the border between Turkey and Bulgaria. It was known by its Greek name as Adrianople, named after the Emperor Adrian. And this is where sultans would go to and have their palace set up and take members of their court there, enjoy fresh air, and hunt. There's a really interesting description of Edirne from the Habsburg diplomat named Oeder de Bousbecq. He wrote a work which is now called the Turkish Letters, which is a great read. It's just all about his experiences and the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s. I really recommend it. So he talks about how sultans would go on hunting expeditions with thousands of huntsmen and falconers. He says the Sultan Bayazid I, who lived in the 1400s, so he's kind of relying on hearsay. We don't know if this is true or not. He said at this time had 7,000 falconers and as many huntsmen. You may suppose from the grandeur of this establishment. One day, in the presence of the Count de Nevers, he flew a falcon at some eagles. The flight did not please him, and he was so wroth that for his fault, he was on the point of beheading 2,000 of his falconers, scolding them for want of diligence in their care of his hawks. Well, that might not be a true story, but one sultan that we know hunted all the time and loved to go hunting during a time of quarantine was Mehmed IV. He actually had the sobriquet, or the nickname, the Hunter, Mehmet Hunter. He spent a lot of time in Edirne, and his long hunting trips around the city basically devastated the forest while thousands of wild animals were killed. There was a terrible plague in Istanbul in 1661, which just cratered the population of the city. And the year before, there had been a fire that broke out. So the lack of infrastructure probably led to this plague. Sultan Mehmet evacuated his whole court from Istanbul to Edirne, which is about 200 miles or so. He spent the winter there, and he basically went on hunting expeditions. But he wasn't nearly as good of a statesman as he was a hunter. When the Grand Vizier, Fazil Ahmet, started an expedition against the Habsburgs on a military campaign, Sultan Mehmed IV accompanied the troops as far as Edirne. He started in Istanbul, went to Edirne, but as the rest of the troops went on into Europe, he stayed behind